Hello and welcome to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. The traditional football signing period starts this week, but since the inception of the early signing period a few years ago, what used to be a February recruiting bonanza is now sort of an afterthought. Most of the top players have signed. Most teams are close to having a full class. There is just not a ton of intrigue and news out there. So instead of previewing signing day 2021, we're jumping ahead to the class of 2022. Joining me to talk about what to look for in recruiting over the next 8 to 10 months is Bud Elliott from 24/7 Sports. We'll ask Bud about how the class is shaping up from position strength, best prospects, teams already off to a fast start, and what a return to normal as the country hopefully begins to pull out of the pandemic means to the recruiting class of 2022. We'll also chat about the coaching news at Tennessee and UCF. Thanks for listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. You can find us on Westwood One Podcast, Apple Podcast, just about anywhere you like to get your podcast. If you like what you hear, give us a good rating and a good review. It helps college football fans find us, and it helps us find more college football fans. And away we go. Joining me this week on the podcast is Bud Elliott from 24/7 Sports. Bud, you know, he kind of cut his teeth in recruiting, does a lot of, you may know him from his work on his past life as sort of the guru of Florida State football, but he's doing 24/7 Sports now, leads the recruiting side, but also knows a lot about college football. So we're going to get into signing day this week, but really, you know, signing day, Bud, is no longer in February. The traditional signing day is just sort of like, you know, tying up loose ends. So instead of bringing you on to talk about what's going to happen tomorrow, we're recording this on a Tuesday afternoon. A lot of that stuff will already be done by some people. Listen, we're not just going to jump ahead. We're going to jump way ahead. We're going to start looking towards 2022 class, because really that's what schools and coaches are doing. They're looking towards 2022. So, Bud, thanks for coming on. And let's start it with this angle. When you start looking at the 2022 class of players, is there anything notable that stands out as far as positions, as far as regions that players maybe are, you know, maybe a state that's a little stronger than other? What, as your first year, as you start taking a summary of the 2022 class, what are some of the things that stand out?
So you mentioned getting a look at these guys, and to be honest, like that's something I wish we could have done. In
maybe that's
many
the place
cases,
to start. Yeah.
Yeah, like in many cases, a lot of times the last time that we've seen these guys was before their junior year, right? The summer before their junior year, if we were able to see them at all. So in some cases, we haven't seen them, you know, since the summer of 2019 or in the fall of 2019 because of when the pandemic hit and you know, how many camps and combines and whatnot were canceled, and some states didn't even play high school football. But as far as looking at the 2022 class, there are some guys about whom we already feel very confident, right? Ohio State got a huge recruiting win. Now they're going to have to hold on to them, but I think they feel pretty confident that they will. In South Lake Carroll's Quinn Ewers. And Ewers is probably the highest rated quarterback since Trevor Lawrence, I think.
That's pretty good.
And it's still really early. And so, like, who knows where he'll end up. Rankings can and luckily do change. I think they need to be dynamic to reflect the nature that you're recruiting, you know, high school kids, and those kids keep growing, and, you know, the lottery that is puberty. But Ewers is really, really good. I mean, athletic, good build, throws well on the run, very accurate, tears up elite level competition in an elite state like Texas. And obviously Texas is going to want him. Now that Steve Sarkisian is in Austin. But so far, Ohio State and Ryan Day managed to hold on to him. So that's been a a big storyline, whether he'd go back to Texas, whether he would stick with Ohio State. We still have a whole year to go.
Right, and he was a Texas commit under Herman for a little while, and then flipped to Ohio State as things sort of went sour at Texas this past season. Though before Herman got fired, it should be noted, before Herman got fired. So I think that's why there's sort of this renewed hope that Sark can go in there and say, hey, I was the guy who did all this great stuff at Alabama, and that might win him back.
I completely agree. I would say another position, or another kid that stands out before we get to positions. Travis Hunter is a corner out of Collins Hill, which is in Sewanee, Georgia, and he is probably the best high school football player in the country right now. I understand having Ewers over him because of positional value. Obviously, the quarterback is going to impact the game more than a cornerback will, but Hunter is probably the best offensive and defensive player in the state of Georgia right now. And that probably includes the dudes who were seniors this year in Georgia. Like he dominated both sides of the ball in a way that is just rare. He's actually committed to Florida State right now, which is kind of shocking because Florida State has had a bad year and then had a couple bad years in a row, actually. But he's a longtime Florida State fan. I believe he's originally from Florida, and I don't want to say lucked into that one, but his relationship with defensive backs coach Marcus Woodson has been really, really positive for the Noles there. As far as positions, I think this is a very nice defensive end year, and particularly, Ralph, if you need to go out and get yourself a dude with like a Myles Garrett type build, not maybe as rocked up, as Garrett was, but in terms of the 6'5", big time wingspan, you can project the player to play at 260 plus in college, and yet still bend the edge. I mean, Jamar Stewart from South Florida is one I really like. We also there's a couple kids out of Texas who I feel are very good. Anai White out of Philly is a big one. There's a guy who's actually only a 4-star right now, but I think he's going to be in serious 5-star consideration for Katy, Texas, who just committed to A&M a couple days ago in Malik Silla. That his film to me looks awesome. He's 6'6", 230. So I will say that the defensive end position, particularly the bigger DNs, they're plentiful this year, which I know programs across the nation are pretty happy to see.
So I just did a very quick aside about Myles Garrett, because you say maybe not quite Myles Garrett, because Myles Garrett in a world where there's a lot of jacked up dudes, right? like we live in a world where we see a lot of big and, jacked up guys. Myles Garrett is still one of the few players who, when I interviewed him at Texas A&M, when I think he was going into his junior year, it still startled you of like, holy cow, like that dude looks like he was created by a god. Like that is unbelievable. Like, I don't know if that looks almost beyond human. He is like the perfect manifestation of a dude, right?
He looked different even in high school. I mean, like that was like, whoa, you're in high school? That's okay.
Anyway, so a good defensive end year. Any positions where you look at and say, you mentioned Ewers at quarterback. Let's just stick. Quarterbacks always are the most interesting thing. So let me just stick on quarterback for a second here. And that is, you talk about Ewers. Your initial, and obviously this could change. We got a full year for guys to develop, but again, we usually have a fairly good sense of where the class is going at this point. About 10 months out of them actually signing, 9 to 10 months out of them actually signing. How does that rest of the quarterback class look?
It's looking pretty good. I think we will see a decent bit of shuffling in the rankings. I believe our next class of 2022 update will come either in February or March. I just want to make sure we get it right before we put it down. We usually do monthly rankings adjustments, but the next one we do for 22 will be a pretty big one, obviously, because we haven't done one in several months, mostly focusing on transfer ratings and in the class of 2021. But Gunnar Stockton just committed to Georgia. He was a former South Carolina commit when South Carolina lost Will Muschamp. I think it's kind of weird, like they lose Will Muschamp and yet they lose a quarterback, because those two things are kind of inversely related usually.
Right. Yeah, that doesn't work
at least
out
in Muschamp's career. But Stockton went ahead and flipped to Georgia, extremely productive passer out of the state. Maybe not quite as projectable a prospect as Ewers, but still somebody who I think can operate Georgia's offense very well. Walker Howard's already committed to LSU, kid at Lafayette, who's a nice player. It's a pretty good quarterback year. You clearly have the one kid in yours who just stands out, but I think this actually could be a better quarterback year than we had this year. And this year was a pretty decent one. It wasn't, Trevor, Justin, JT, but it was pretty nice.
Is there a place where you're going as far as positions and you say, we're still waiting for some guys to emerge here? If this is a place you're looking for to get some immediate help, you might not, beyond maybe one or two players, be looking here?
I think I want to see more out of the linebacker position overall. There's a couple guys who stand out early. Ohio State has a nice pair in Gabe Powers and CJ Hicks. We have, what's his name? Harold Perkins out of Texas as the number one backer in the country. But really beyond that, there's more guys who I want to see in person. You have a lot of dudes who rack up crazy stats, but I'd like to see more of these outside linebackers to see how they move, to see how they cover in space, right? If you have a really good high school linebacker who can cover, for the most part, teams just aren't picking on him. And so it can be difficult to evaluate that solely off film. A lot of times I get a lot out of some of these camp settings where you put some of these backers in space because college is becoming more of a space game. I also think we have some questions about the depth of the corner position. All these teams are looking to take so many good corners, and there's just only so much supply. Mm-hmm. I think we'll have kids emerge, but we already mentioned Hunter and Domani Jackson, who's committed to the USC, is a no doubter as well. But beyond that, I think there's a lot of disagreement with the ranking services as well as to who they think is best. And like I mentioned at the linebacker position, if you have a really good high school corner, for the most part, teams aren't throwing at him. And so getting to see these guys in 7-on-7, I've been in 2 7-on-7s in the last 2 weekends. That's been pretty instructive, to be honest, to get a real feel for how big these guys are in person, how well they move. And I still think seeing guys in person matters. And that's been nice to be able to get back on the road some.
Okay, you opened up a couple of different lines there. Let's stick with this one on the corners. Are schools recruiting corners similarly to the way NFL teams draft them? In other words, just in bulk. If you watch the NFL draft, at a certain point, it simply becomes, okay, what's the best corner we can grab here? And we're just going to grab as many of them as possible because there's so many. A, we need a lot of them on the field these days. And B, if we take a lot of them, maybe one or two of them will hit. Have we moved to that point where just corners get valued up a little more, hence they are recruited in bulk?
They definitely have been valued up some. And I think most of that is related to, like in the NFL, college offenses are becoming better at, instead of just running it like a holistic, concept-based offense, they're becoming better at just picking on one guy over and over again. You saw this some in the national title game. You saw Clemson and Ohio State both pick on each other's guys who really can't cover all that well in that semifinal game. So making sure that you have enough guys on the field who aren't ducks. You know the phrase "find the duck," right? And to make sure you don't have too many ducks on the field, I think that's really been a key. So we are seeing programs put a greater emphasis on that. But it's also, Ralph, I think, related to the necessity to play more nickel and more dime packages, where you have 5 and 6 defensive backs on the field at any one time. And if you're going to run that, you can't just carry 12 DBs anymore because some of these programs are carrying 17 DBs. You need it.
So you mentioned seeing people in person, and that's been a theme, right? Because, in a lot of ways, there has been some high school football shut down. There has been less of it. Coaches haven't been allowed on the road. I don't know how much even the recruiting analysts have been traveling as much. Opportunities for camps have been limited. We talked about, in fact, when you and Barton Simmons, your former colleague who's now at Vanderbilt University, and we'll talk about that. When you and Barton were on, we talked about how much that this 2021 class was going to be impacted. But really, while there's a lot of focus on that, it could be the 2022 class that is more greatly impacted, or that we're going to have to sort of like play catch up when things hopefully return to more normal in the spring and summer. So when you start talking about the 2022 class and how it's going to be impacted by this somewhat lost year to the pandemic, and hopefully we start getting back to normal in the summer.
It most definitely will. I think we're going to be rather conservative in terms of handing out, really high star ratings at first, just to make sure we have it right. I know that's the mindset of a lot of the guys on the rankings council, and we want to make sure we do a good job with that. But in some cases, you're going to be seeing some of these guys for the first time. Now, that happens every year because kids emerge out of nowhere seemingly at times. But I think you're going to be seeing a greater percentage of these players for the first time or for the first time in a while. So it's going to matter a whole lot. The other thing, Ralph, is I think offers and spots might be a little bit slow to develop this year because of something that I think has been, I've tried to cover it for months now, and I've written about it, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 times. But COVID bonus year seniors, so that the guys who were seniors in 2020 who are electing to come back for 21, they don't count against your cap of 85 players, right? They're in the accounting math, they don't count. But for 2022 and 2023 and 2024 seasons, all these guys who get these bonus years, the NCAA has not passed anything that says that they don't count against the cap.
Yeah, and I don't think they're going to. I think that they might be squeezed to, but the general sense of that is, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but just, from talking to people, is like they don't really want to start messing with the caps. And when we saw, also I should say for the caps, 25 per year cap, 85 total cap. You can't go more than 25 signees per year. You can't go more than 85 scholarship players on your roster. But these seniors coming back next year don't count against either the 25 or the 85.
Correct. Right. And guys already on the roster would never count against the 25.
Right. But
they do they do count against your overall 85 cap. What this is going to cause, though, is, and I got a lot of buddies who work at small schools, and they're telling me, hey, our admin is not going to support any kind of rule that says go above 85 cap because we can't afford to pay
for them. Yeah,
for 100 scholarships. So let's say you have 10 guys who want to come back. Now, you as a school don't have to let them back. That's kind of a sneaky thing people don't know. Like the player can say, yeah, I want to use my extra year. And you as the school can say, well, good luck, but you're not using it here. Right.
Or feel free to walk. Feel free to be a walk-on, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Exactly. Although, can you become a walk-on at the school at which your scholarship?
Well, you could. I think you can give up your scholarship if you choose to.
Okay.
Yeah, if you choose to, you can give up your scholarship and play as a non-scholarship player. I believe that's the case. I probably have to check that, but I believe that's the case.
That's interesting. I think if that's the case, we'll probably see that a couple times. But let's say you have, as a school, 10 players who want to come back and you actually want to take them back, and the 85 cap is not expanded. That's going to be 10 fewer new players that you could bring on through recruiting. So you're probably going to see quite a few schools sign smaller classes than normal. And that's before we even take into account the fact that schools are already signing smaller classes than they used to because they're taking advantage of the transfer portal. I mean, Oklahoma, Penn State, Florida State, a couple other ones, they signed an average of 16 high schoolers this year because they're leaving 7-8 spots open for transfers. And that's probably not going to be a yearly thing for each school. But I think overall, there's a pretty good shot that there are going to be fewer high school players signed, at least until we get through all this COVID math, which will take 2 or 3 years if certain rules aren't passed.
So the other avenue that you opened up there when you mentioned it's Damani Jackson as the corner, right, from California?
Yep.
Who's already committed to USC. That's a big deal. Now, one thing I'll mention on the 2021, USC also signed Corey Foreman, who is, by some accounts, the number 1 player in the 2021 class. Does 24/7 have Corey Foreman as number 1?
No, we actually have him, I believe, as number 2.
Okay.
We have JT as number 1.
Okay. And ultimately, listen, I mean, if you're 1, 2, or 3, that's the type of player USC needs to keep, and has sort of, hasn't done as good a job as keeping that kid in state. So it's a big deal that USC not just, signed Foreman, but got a commitment from Damani Jackson, who is sort of considered a top, he's a 5-star sort of top 5 to 10 type player. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah. At least at this early stage. I mean, he's a dominant player.
Gotcha. So, which leads me to this. So that seems like that might be a good sign for USC heading into the 2022 class. They sort of finished strong in 2021. Everything is always a little uncertain when it comes to Clay Helton and his status at USC. But let's start with USC and then maybe branch off into some other teams that have gotten off to fast starts.
Sure. So USC is obviously doing a really good job. But the main thing, Ralph, with USC was they finished 64th in the 2022 recruiting class, which was, pretty bad, obviously. And they made some important staff changes to address that. They had some new guys in with some better Southern California connections. They got some guys who were just better recruiters on that staff, and then they were able to get off to a nice start this year. They're expected to close tomorrow or Wednesday, whenever we release this, with Rajon Davis, who's a top 40 player for us at the linebacker position. So they're going to have a really nice class this year, and they are off to a nice start. They already have Damani Jackson, as you mentioned. They have Fabian Ross out of Vegas, another corner. They already have a quarterback in Devin Brown, and they actually have a center prospect from IMG, Dylan Lopez, who I usually see all the IMG kids, but I've not actually seen him yet, so I don't really know how good he is necessarily. He's a 3-star so far on the composite, but USC has gotten off to a really nice start, and look, I think that you can have Oregon carry the Pac-12 in some respects, but the Pac-12 does look better if the program that most people out there consider the program that needs to play up to its ceiling actually does so. And who knows what will happen with Clay Helton if they have another year like they've been having. But the recruiting is most definitely better. And it is hard to mess up USC. They have right of first refusal on so many kids west of the Rockies. Like you should be a top 5 recruiting team pretty much every year.
But it did seem as if they were losing that a certain amount when you see a DJ Ungalele leave and go all the way across the country, and he says things like, I just feel like the quality of football is not what it needs to be in the Pac-12, and that reflects on USC. And also regionally, when Oregon dips into California so strongly and pulls out significant players. So I think you're right. I think USC needs to be sort of, hey, we right of first refusal. That's what USC has always been great, but it had lost that a little bit over the last couple of years.
There's no doubt about it. I think that's in large part what was so important about getting those coaching changes made for the Trojans. Other teams that are off to fast starts in 2022, Ohio State they already have 10 commits, including 3 composite 5-stars. I mean, who knows if these kids will stay?
Yeah, including Quinn Ewers, who we talked about earlier.
Yeah, Quinn Ewers is going to stay a 5-star. I'm like 99.99% sure on that. Jahim Singletary is one of the best players in the state of Florida. They dipped down to Urban Meyer's old stomping grounds, and I guess actually Urban's back now in a different role. They're able to get him out of Jacksonville. They're off to a nice start as well at the receiver position with Caleb Burton, who's out of the state of Texas. So they have the number 1 receiver in the country from Texas, the number 1 quarterback in the country also from Texas. So some work to be done there for Steve Sarkisian and Jimbo to be sure. So they're off to a nice start. Penn State has actually done a really nice job in 2022. They already have 8 commitments. All of them 4-stars or better so far. And who else? Georgia, as we mentioned earlier, getting the quarterback. Florida State, largely on the back of Travis Hunter, has done a nice job, at least relative to the type of season they had. They just picked up a legacy in Aaron Hester, who's a pretty solid player. And then they have a couple other guys in that class who we think will probably rise in the rankings just based on the seasons that they just had. So they're off to a pretty solid start.
Let me stop you. Let me stop you on Florida State. I'm sorry. I definitely want to get to BC and Hafley because they sort of qualify as the, who knew, like, oh wow, like look at that. But Florida State is a place where very well because you've been covering them for a long time. And I guess I don't want to get too deep into the weeds there because this could be a totally a podcast all of its own of what's wrong with Florida State and how does it come back. But do you see a path where Florida State can fix a lot of what needs to be fixed at Florida State simply by recruiting the way Florida State can recruit?
For sure.
Can they just simply recruit their way out of this?
Yeah, I think you have to, as long as you incorporate transfers and patience within the scope of recruiting. When you make the decision to fire a coach after only 2 years in the early signing period era, you're basically committing to a long-term rebuild, because we know for a fact that the classes these coaches sign when they only have 2 or 3 weeks to put them together, like we've seen in the early signing period era, because it used to be you had about 8 weeks. You could at least kind of get to know some of these kids. Now you sign your contract and you're signing players the next week, and you don't know these guys. The attrition rates, the bust factor on these classes that these coaches sign in their first year, that kind of short season class they put together, is through the roof. And when you when you fire a coach after only 2 years, that means you have 2 of those classes in a 3-year period. Mm-hmm. So your roster is going to be pretty bad for a while, because your attrition rates are going to be crazy. You, in some cases, some of these 4-stars you're getting because other schools didn't want them. Maybe those schools, or they didn't want them as much. Maybe they didn't like their competitive temperament or something about their character, or maybe they, maybe they saw the kid more recently and saw that he put on a bunch of bad weight or something like that. I think you'll see that one of the lessons learned about the early signing period, and this certainly applies to Florida State, is that you need to have some patience overall. That's not saying they made the wrong decision, but it's a factor you have to consider as an administration when you do that. And so you're signing up for a longer term rebuild if you do decide to axe somebody after just 2 years.
And you live in Florida, but I mean, is the damage done to the Florida State brand so bad that you have kids who normally would be, wow, that kid's, Florida State will be in on that kid. Are you seeing like, wow, the Florida State doesn't even, like, are they seriously in on this kid? Are kids showing any signs that like they're not taking Florida State as seriously as maybe they normally would have a couple of years back? Does the brand tarnish that quickly?
It certainly does. Particularly because with a new staff, I think more than half of these kids that Florida State signed, they never saw in person. They never met in person, because like the new staff comes in, the pandemic hits. I don't think a lot of these kids knew who the heck Mike Norvell was. They don't watch much college football. They certainly aren't watching Memphis.
Right.
And so, you got this new staff in there. They don't get to meet these guys in person. They try to form relationships over Zoom. I mean, we've seen this with all these new staffs, basically. And when visits were shut down, it was pretty much impossible. I think that's why they elected to only sign 15 or 16 high school players and use 9 or 10 spots on transfers, because they didn't have those relationships. This year so far, I have been surprised at how well this staff has been received, because they still haven't had a chance to get out there and meet these guys in person and actually eyeball them and meet their coaches and whatnot. But part of it is because of the legacy factor. There are a lot of legacies in the state for FSU, and some guys who just grew up as fans of Florida State, of Jalen Ramsey and Jameis and Telvin Smith and those type dudes.
Yeah, it's not that long ago. It's not that long ago
exactly.
that things were really rolling.
You would think it would go in an opposite direction, right? That they would still have some interest last year, and then because of the 3-win season, you would have even less interest this year. But it seems like they've done a decent job in-house of counteracting that and selling their vision over Zoom. So we're seeing increased interest so far this year.
Okay, so I cut you off there when you were going to mention an interesting team, because I kind of wanted you to throw at least 1 or 2 teams that are not the obvious ones when you say who's off to a great start. And you mentioned BC, which already has 7 commits. Jeff Hafley, the former Ohio State defensive coordinator, had a pretty nice year last year. But sometimes I will say that a first year on the field can be a little deceiving. That could be a little fool's gold. You get a couple of breaks, maybe you have some players left over from the last staff that, are upperclassmen that hit. And it's not always a totally indicative of where that coach is going to go on the field. You in some ways could get more, where you need to have that recruiting on the back end. If you want to, you can confirm what you might have seen on the field on the recruiting piece. And it looks like Jeff Hafley, at a place that doesn't necessarily recruit top 15, even top 20 classes, might be on his way to maybe a top 30 class.
I thought they did a really nice job of evaluating players in the 2021 class. And then they had several kids decommit who I don't want to say found, but were willing to pull the trigger on an offer very early in the process. Ultimately those kids decommitted and went to schools with, I'll say better schools, but schools that have had more football success, maybe are a level up, including Trevin Wallace, the linebacker out of Georgia, who's a standout player on both sides of the football and also a track guy. And he was very much in 5-star consideration for us down the stretch. He was a Boston College commit for a while, and then kind of the bigger boys came calling and he decommitted. But I think that speaks well of BC's identification and offering process. They are already off to a fast start as well this year with 7 commits, as you said, and they're not afraid to trust their own formula, right? They're offering kids that we don't have any stars on yet. They seem to do their own thing, and it's their process has shown good results. In fact, I think if you look at probably the majority of kids Boston College offered probably went up in terms of star rating after the BC offer, which means we got to see more on them. So BC was correct in taking that risk if you use our evaluations and our star process to judge their results, which maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. But I think he's doing a very nice job there. But to your point, if you look at Bill Connolly's second order win stats, which says, okay, based on how you played in these games, what would your record be if you played them a bunch of times? BC finished 6-5. Their second order wins were 4.5. Mm-hmm. So they were, a win and a half worse on the second order win stuff than their actual record, which does indicate they had some pretty good luck. We'll see if they can either play better or keep that level of luck going forward.
I want to hit on another. Now, again, to say like your class is 18th in the country on February 3rd, I think it is today, is who knows what exactly that means. However, I am curious about what Maryland is doing because, even in this past class, yet again, Maryland sort of swooped in and stole a high 4, low 5-star player away from an SEC school. They have 5 commits for 2022. Again, that puts them at number 18. I don't know exactly what that means, but it does seem like there could be, there has always been this thought that like there's a high ceiling there at Maryland because the DMV area is just teeming with talent. You just dip into Virginia and you could even like go not too far into the Carolinas. And there's just so much talent in that corridor that maybe there's some untapped potential there for Maryland. You could even reach up into New Jersey if you're Maryland and to Pennsylvania. Early read on, it's only year 2 of Loxley, but early read on what they're doing recruiting wise. And is there reason for optimism?
I certainly think there is reason for optimism. I was not a big believer in the Mike Loxley hire, personally, because his results at prior stops on the field coaching, were just so bad.
Yep. I agree.
It was hard to overlook that. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that you should overlook that personally. But Maryland, they went 2-3 this year. They probably should have been 3-2. I think they were a little bit unlucky in some of their games. They probably should have beaten Rutgers, to be honest, and they were right there for a time with Indiana. Mike Loxley, recruiting wise, I really never have any questions about him. The guy's an excellent recruiter. He knows how to get it done. He has a ton of relationships in the DC, in the DMV, in the Baltimore area. He's going to get some talent there to Maryland. My only real question was, could he coach it? I think he's assembled a pretty solid staff there as far as coaching, and we'll see what they're able to do. The issue is that division. If you stick Maryland in the West, I'd feel a lot better about it.
Yeah. That
they have to play in the East means there's a ceiling. Like are they ever going to finish better than what, 4th in the East? It seems unlikely, but possible, I guess.
Yeah, all things have to sort of fall together like it did for Indiana this year, where you have, Penn State in an anomalous year, Michigan in a down year, Michigan State in a down year, and all of a sudden you rocket ship up. But you're right. That is a job that is going to be dependent on your competition. There are other schools there that are going to have to come back to you to a certain degree before you to take a big step forward. Let me do one more thing here with you on this topic, and then we'll take a quick break, and then we'll switch it over to something a little more current. And that is, Listen, I understand Georgia's always got great players, and when I say the state of Georgia, the state of Florida, the state of Texas, those are where the great players come from. But when I ask you, is there a particular region? We saw this a couple of years back. I think Iowa was particularly stacked in a recent year, and it turned out that was a good year for the Hawkeyes, right? The Hawkeyes were able to load up a little more and end up building a couple of years off of that. Is there it could be one of the prominent states like Georgia or Florida, or maybe one of the ones a little outside what we know as the places where there's always a mountain of talent. Is there a state or two in 2022 where you go, boy, this is a year where that in-state team could really clean up because that state is really loaded?
I really haven't seen it yet on 2022. And I think part of that is because,
again, we just had seeing
we're
people.
Still,
right.
Yeah. Well, and also some states didn't play, right? So like you measure these states against what they normally put out, but you're also measuring them against one another. And I mean, we haven't seen some of these California kids since the fall of 2019. So it's a hard thing to say for that. I will say for this year, I thought North Carolina was particularly loaded, and Mac Brown and his staff, they really cleaned up. If you look at North Carolina for 2021, I mean, that was extremely fortunate. But that's also an area that is improving rapidly. I mean, it's a growing metro area around Charlotte, and you got other major areas in that state as well that are producing a whole lot of talent. That's a good place to be. I think Tennessee, very early read on this, but I do think Tennessee looks like it is pacing for more high-end talent than it normally has, which has got to be just painful to hear if you're a Vols fan, considering what they just did to their coaching staff, or what the staff did to itself, depending on who you believe.
Is that it's funny. My friend Ari Wasserman and Andy Staples were just mentioning this a little in passing on their recent pod about. And again, this is something that would have been right up Barton's alley, and probably a big reason why Clark Lee took that job at Vanderbilt. Nashville is a booming place. I wonder if Nashville is going to sort of have a look of maybe not full-blown Atlanta, which is just maybe the best place in the country to recruit outside the Dallas area, or maybe as good as the Dallas area at this point. But is Nashville sort of a budding place because of the population boom around it? Are we looking at like maybe in 4 or 5 years, Nashville will look more closer to what Atlanta looks?
Yeah, Nashville is certainly growing. I think you're probably 10 years away, okay, if it happens from getting to where Atlanta is, because Atlanta is just so established, right? And they not only do you have the population boom, but you have the investment in both the public schools in terms of facilities and what they pay coaches. We routinely lose high school coaches from the state of Florida to go coach in Metro Atlanta.
Yeah, I wrote about that a couple of years ago. Yeah, about why Metro Atlanta has just boomed over and also Metro Atlanta being so damn big, right? You can drive an hour and a half away from Atlanta and you're still in sort of Metro Atlanta. Right,
100%. But I will say Nashville is certainly booming, and 24/7 Sports headquartered there as well. So that's pretty convenient. It looks like a very nice year in Tennessee for next year's class, though. So we'll see if the Vols can do something about that. We'll see if Barton over at Vandy, can do something with that. And that's an interesting challenge of that job, because you sort of have to figure out. It's almost a baseball element in some ways, where if you're recruiting college baseball, you're recruiting against other college teams as well, but you're also recruiting against, okay, are these guys going to come and get plucked by major league teams? Right. Mm-hmm. At Vandy, that's kind of the thing you have to guard against. You have to recruit against your other high academic schools, but you also have to make sure the kid you're signing is either A, has some reason he's going to stick with you, right? If Alabama comes calling, if LSU comes calling, or B, like, is this the best kid that we can get who won't get that Bama or LSU offer? You know what I mean? Like, you have to find that sweet spot. That's a very difficult challenge.
Yeah, it's like interesting. When Stanford really had it rolling, they were able to sell to nothing is quite like Stanford. Like, there are other high academic schools which will sort of sell themselves as we're kind of like Stanford. Nothing is quite like Stanford as far as the difficulty of getting kids in there. But the vision you're selling is probably similar. And what they would sell to a lot of players, and I'll sort of colloquialize it to a certain degree, is if you're a great football player and you're super smart, just don't go to a football factory, right? Come be around other really super smart people. And you can grow, you can be a great football player here and you can go to the NFL, but you can also work on your entrepreneurialism and you can work on all the other great parts of the aspects and interesting things that make you an interesting person beyond football. You can do all that here too. And I think Notre Dame has tried to sell that to a certain degree and has sort of taken some of that vision. And it's the reason why Kelly has done so well over the last couple of years. We're not going to target every kid. We're going to target the kids who can work here and who will embrace the culture here and sort of embrace what we have to offer. And I think that's what Vanderbilt's going to try to do. Hey, just don't go to the football factory. Come here and be with people who are more like you. Like the big brains who are interested in things beyond football. And that sounds a little condescending when you talk about the other schools, but that's sort of what you're trying to get at. You're trying to get at those kids who think a little bit beyond just football. And it'll be interesting to see if Vanderbilt can tap into that while also still being in the SEC, which is a monster. Right. It's one thing to do it at Stanford. It's another thing to do it in the SEC where everybody's got, bigger and better facilities than you.
And I mean, they also they've got a long ways to climb. This probably will not be very quick at Vandy, given the fact that, I mean, this Vandy team we just saw, by the power ratings, it was one of the worst SEC teams in the last 40 years.
Yeah.
I mean, like they've got they could make massive improvements just to go from terrible to bad. You know what I mean? But you're exactly right as far as the recruiting approach, Ralph. I think that you largely nailed it there. The one thing that killed Stanford, I think, is the early signing period. Mm-hmm. David Shaw was very vocal about this. If you recall, 5, 6, 7 years ago, when the early signing period idea was being bandied about, he was probably the most vocal anti-early signing period coach out there. And the reason is, at least at the time, Stanford did not give admission decisions to kids that early. Right. And so they would wait. Like Stanford would oftentimes be one of the last offers to come out. It would be one of the last schools to accept commits, and a lot of times their guys wouldn't know if they were going to get into school until right before traditional National Signing Day in early February, like tomorrow. With the early signing period, I think that's really hurt them. I did some analysis on that earlier this year, and it's hurt. Vanderbilt does not have that problem, so like that is definitely one advantage that they have. But like you said, nowhere is Stanford.
Okay, so we're going to take a quick break here on the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast, talking with Bud Elliott from 24/7 Sports. We're going to shift this away from, you brought up Tennessee, and so Tennessee will also lead to UCF, and that's sort of the news of the week, what that hire and where UCF might be going. So we'll finish it up with a little UCF Tennessee talk right after this on the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast.
Hey, all podcast consumers, Rich Eisen here. So often, aspiration comes from inspiration, with titans of industry being those torchbearers. With guests from the world of news, business, sports, and entertainment, my new show is going to give you their most in-depth first-hand stories that focuses on the humble beginnings and humbling moments that we can relate to in our own lives. The podcast is called Just Getting Started, with me, Rich Eisen. Listen on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your shows.
We're back on the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast, joined by Bud Elliott from 247 Sports. So we did all the recruiting talk and talked about the 2022 class. Let's talk about some of the things that have happened recently. I haven't had, like the last time I cut a show, Josh Heupel was not yet the Tennessee coach, though it was sort of heading that way. I don't want to rehash too much old news here, but it was surprising. It was a little surprising that they landed on Heupel because, again, why would you have a 6 or 7 day search when you could have just brought Heupel with you on the plane if you were Danny White? However, Let's think about it from this angle, Bud, because again, you now live in Orlando. You're a Florida guy a lot of your life, but you now live in Orlando, so you've got an idea of what UCF is and the power of UCF. And one of the things that got posed to me when Heupel got hired online was like, isn't UCF a better job? And yes and no, kind of depending on what your perspective is. Like, you're going to make a lot more money at Tennessee, and the ceiling to compete for national championships because you're in the SEC is different when it comes to the Tennessee job. But right now, UCF is in a far better position to be successful comparative to its competition. Is it a no-brainer for Josh Heupel to have left this job? And who are some of the names that you think of? I know that's not necessarily your forte, but you're down there that you think of that, hey, this could be a good person to step into UCF.
Yeah. So first of all, I do think it's absolutely a no-brainer for Heupel to take the Tennessee job.
And I do
the
too,
reason why,
just to go on the record there. So.
Yeah, there's no doubt you take that job because that's truly life-changing money. I think you take that job knowing full well that the odds you get fired in 4 years are really high.
Yeah.
Right. You're kind of babysitting them through what is going to be a very tough transition, hoping to score some points and sell some tickets. And maybe, clearly you're not planning on that, but you got to realize that might be what occurs. And then you'll also walk away with $25 million guaranteed, maybe more if these sanctions are as bad as some people think they might be, because there's that kicker in his contract that says he gets another year or two, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Right. That's kind of standard, right? Yep.
So the reason why he wasn't on the plane with Danny White at first is because it's very obvious he wasn't first choice. Now, all ADs say that they always get their first choice, and he was the only person who's offered the job. As our friend Dan Wolkin says, nobody's ever offered the job until they tell you they're going to accept it.
Right.
So, but I think it was smart for him to leave, and I think it probably is fairly illuminating on Tennessee's process and who was not interested in Tennessee, at this time. For UCF though, that's a hell of a job. You have a very hungry fan base, a fan base that donates pretty well, a school that charges its students a lot in student fees, so they're fairly flush with cash. They just got, I believe, $5 million in combined buyout between Danny White and Josh Heupel.
A lot of students too. That school is enormous.
Yes. It's like $50K, right?
Yeah, it's something along those lines. Yeah, it's the largest university in the state of Florida, right? It's the largest as far as student body, I believe, in the state of Florida.
It's one of the biggest in the country, I believe. I think Penn State's system might be larger.
Ohio State and Arizona State are, I think, the two others.
Okay. As far as who I would go get, I think you have to realize what your identity is as a brand. That they've run a wide open, very fast paced, exciting type of offense and won a lot of games doing so. I don't think you can go away from that. I don't think being in Florida, you should go away from that. I think that's how you should probably operate given the amount of speed that this state produces. Two names I would look at. One, Jeff Levy, who's currently the offensive coordinator for Lane Kiffin at Ole Miss. He was at UCF.
Yeah, he came there with Heupel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then the other one, and look, he may be in consideration for Tennessee. I don't know. The other one I think I'd probably look at would be Rhett Lashley, who was the offensive coordinator at Miami. Did a nice job this year. They had a major turnaround. He's worked under Sonny Dykes. He's worked under Gus Malzahn. Did a nice job. Miami knows the state as far as recruiting. That would make a lot of sense too. But I think it'll be somebody who is up-tempo, fast-paced offense and exciting, because you still do have to sell tickets and win games.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that they should stay close to their identity. I also think that they shouldn't get too. And so, quite frankly, Josh Heupel was a coach hired by Danny White because they were able to build in a pretty big buyout. And I think he looked at Heupel as somebody who wasn't going to do what Frost did, which was bail out in 2 years after he had a little bit of success. And I don't know if Heupel would have without this situation coming up and White moving over to Tennessee. They probably would have had a guy there for 3 years, and he's already been there 3 years, and probably would have had him for at least a fourth. Whoever the next AD is at UCF, don't get lured into, I want to make sure our guy stays for a while. Just get the best guy. Even if he's gone in 2 years, just get the best guy. I think that sometimes, and I understand why Danny White could feel a little burned and sort of say, hey, we are building this great thing here, and I want a coach who's going to be committed for not the super long term, but at least longer than 2 years. So that's why I'm going to, land on Josh Heupel as opposed to maybe some others. But I hope that the next AD doesn't get too caught up in that and just decides like, listen, I'm not going to strap you with a huge buyout. We just want the best coach, and we'll deal with it when it comes in a couple of years. If you've had 2 undefeated seasons and you want to move on, we'll deal with it then. But I don't be short-term thinkers don't think of it as we want a coach who will stay. We just want a coach who will win.
I mean, you think about some schools that have made that mistake.
Well,
right?
Houston,
Bill
Houston.
Stewart.
Bill Stewart was a situation one that too. Yeah.
And we'll see about App State, right?
Yeah.
Their recent in-house hire. I forgot the guy's name now, but he was making a big deal about wanting to stay there.
Yeah. Sean Clark was right. Am I getting that right? Sean Clark. Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. I agree with you. Like UCF, unless it joins a conference, is an awesome job and a stepping stone job.
Yes.
You can be both.
It can be both. It can be both. And it'll attract a lot of really good people. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if there's even some Power 5 coaches who are looking at that going like, that might be better than what I got. So cause I'll win. If nothing else, I'll be able to win. I may not get paid. I may only make as much. I may not get a big raise there, but at least I will be in position to win, and then I'll work on the raise later.
Right. 100%. I think the buyout thing too is, I think you can get a really good coach there even by putting a big buyout on him. Yeah. Because most of these teams who you'd want to leave UCF for, they have the cash to buy you out.
That's a good point too. Right. So let me tip this over to a broader conversation on Tennessee. This will be the last thing I'll ask you on, because I think the state of Tennessee, we've talked so much about that. If I took every nickel for every minute I've spent on the state of Tennessee, the state of Texas, the program, the state of USC program, I would be a very rich man over the last year talking about those schools. But let me frame it to you this way. Can Tennessee and South Carolina both be good at the same time? Can they both be maxing out? I'm going to assume Georgia and Florida are being competently run and are near their ceilings. Maybe not at their ceilings, but at least near their ceilings. There's only so many wins to go around. Can South Carolina and Tennessee both be really good at the same time?
I'm going to say not if Clemson and North Carolina are anywhere near their current forms. And even NC State, who had a nice year this year and for the most part under Dave Doran have been pretty decent. I think you need to, if you're going to have one of those teams elevate, they probably need the other one to be down, because you need to beat the other one in recruiting for a couple players a year. Mm-hmm. If you're splitting them, I don't see how you rise to the top of the division. South Carolina's expectations have never really made sense to me personally, but they look at Clemson and say, if Clemson can do it, why can't we? That's probably a longer podcast.
Well, Tennessee at least has a history. I am a big believer of you will be what you have been. So I think tradition and history matters. And if I have a history at Tennessee that shows some peaks and some valleys, but some very high level success, I believe that you can get back to that, unless it's from the Stone Ages. I mean, like Minnesota used to win national championships. That was a long time ago. But if you have something that looks like a history of high level success, not that far into your rearview mirror, I feel like it's attainable again. When you look into the weeds of South Carolina, yes, there is some high level success fairly recently under Spurrier, but that was the anomaly over the course of that program, over the history of that program.
There's no doubt. I think Tennessee can be good again. I just don't know how soon it will happen. If I'm Tennessee, and I said this on the Cover 3 podcast on the CBS Sports College Podcast Network, I would put almost all my sanctions front loaded, because you're probably going to be playing at less than 85 this year anyway, just given the number of transfers you've had out. And I would just bite the bullet and go
less
ahead.
Less than 85. I think they'd be lucky. They're going to be lucky to have 65 at this point.
Yeah, I mean, why not say, all right, we're going to self-impose 15 scholarships this year?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I mean, like, it's kind of one of those things where on paper it looks real harsh. In reality, you're denying scholarships to kids who weren't there anyway, so it doesn't even hurt you at all. Then I think you can bounce back fairly quickly. The problem is that Florida has been a much better program than you for about 30 years now overall. And Georgia seems to finally have its act together in recruiting in a way that is a clear step up from where Mark Richt had it. You also have to play Alabama every year in an unfortunate cross-division draw, which I know is a rivalry, but hasn't really been competitive in over a decade. So what's your ceiling there? I mean, how often are you ever going to win 2 of those 3 games? It's not often. Well, but I think they can get back within a couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, your idea is that Saban's not going to be there forever. Like you just keep selling the fact that Saban's not going to be there forever. You made an interesting point. Let me hit on that when you mentioned that maybe self-imposing relatively soon might not be a bad idea. Because I had somebody describe the Tennessee job as 2 rebuilds. You're going to have the front end where we're going to have complete and total roster turnover next year. Next year is shot. Next year will almost be impossible to salvage. And then when the NCAA stuff cycles through, you might be looking at 2 to 3 years out when now sanctions kick in and you have a roster of kids who can one-time exception all bail out on you. Because, we're not going, like, we've made a little progress, but now we're not going to a bowl game. And now we're getting hit with scholarship sanctions. So when you talk about like Josh Heupel might be 4 years and out, hopefully, maybe 4 years and out, it's almost like that's what you were selling to a coach. You were selling to a coach, listen, like, you're not going to have 1 rebuild, you're going to have 2, and there's almost no way you're getting through this.
I mean, do you think Heupel really believes he's getting through it?
Listen, I think they're all super competitive and are built to believe that they can do it, that they will have a plan that can make it work. So yes, I don't think you step into that thinking that you believe, I think to be that position, to have that position, you think you're smart, right? You think you have the ability to do it. I don't know. I mean, if I shot him up with truth serum, maybe not.
His agent, though, the guy telling him to take the deal, is not predicating the acceptance of that deal on getting through to year 5, 6, 7. Let's look at the guaranteed money.
That no doubt. I have to think an agent is realistic enough to think that, listen, even if this doesn't work out, even if in 4 years, because the other thing too is you can sell me on, we're going to be patient. We're going to be patient. That's quite frankly bullshit. I don't curse on the podcast that often, but it was particularly relevant here. They had patience with Jeremy Pruitt right up until he lost to Georgia State to start year two. So even after he won 6 games in a row, and it seems like they righted the ships, he had already poisoned the water there because they had known the Georgia State loss was in the back of their minds. And within 3 years, Jeremy Pruitt is gone. So patience does not truly exist. Patience means we're going to give you a mulligan on year 1. And if we're not seeing at least trajectory, at least like things on the upswing by mid-year 2, we're already pretty much done with you.
There's no doubt. If I'm Tennessee, I front load this stuff just with the idea that we need to be much better in 4 to 5 years. I don't want this to be a slow bleed. Just rip the Band-Aid, go really bad the next 2-3 years, and then start the build. I think you nailed it as far as the 2 rebuilds. That's a really smart thought. I'm not of the opinion
I stole it from somebody,
so will do both rebuilds.
Yeah, I would agree with you too. I think the second rebuild essentially ends up on somebody else's plate. So the last thing I want to hit you on, Bud, and I appreciate you taking a lot of time with me here today, is your former colleague Barton Simmons. So Barton was hired by Clark Lee, the new Vanderbilt coach, previously the defensive coordinator at Notre Dame, in basically a player personnel role. And it's something that we've seen a lot of, and we even mentioned it when Barton was on the podcast with you in December about how, something we've seen a lot of in basketball, kind of going from the media to school to NBA, that transition to front office transition. And I don't know. I don't know if this is a trend, but congratulations to Barton, because he is a great guy and deserves it. But do you think this could be something that we start seeing a little more of, the media, the guys who do what you do, and maybe are even like more deeper into the analytical side, as opposed to, though I don't want to take away from that. You definitely do that, but you've sort of entrenched yourself a little more on the editorial side at this point in your role. But when you look at, do you think this could be a little bit of a trend where we might see schools start dipping into your ranks?
I certainly think it could. I don't think it'll be as fast as it's been in the other sports, but if you look at it, the sport that we all recognize as being first to sort of embrace new methods and think outside the box and embrace analytics was baseball, right? I mean, they were into the advanced stats 20, 30 years ago. Football is nowhere close. Basketball sort of in the middle ground there. So if you look at sort of the pace of people who work on the media side being hired, that trend sort of mirrors the adoption of different ways of thinking about the game and running teams as far as the timeline of those other sports. I mean, baseball was the first to do it, and they were also the first to hire a lot of guys. I mean, if you look at Fangraphs, it seems like half of Fangraphs staff has been hired away by baseball teams at some point, up into like the point where yesterday Kevin Goldstein is back at Fangraphs. He actually left he was let go by the Astros, and now he's back.
Oh, wow.
It's kind of cycled back.
I didn't notice that. Yeah, that's interesting.
The NBA was sort of the middle ground there. I definitely think there's a place for it in college. The thing is, there's been opportunities I know for certain guys to do this, but not at the level that Barton got. Barton got he's the director of recruiting at an SEC school. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times I think you could maybe get there if you were willing to take like an assistant spot at a low level P5 or at a G5, but those jobs don't pay that well.
Yeah, it's almost like an analyst, but even a low-level analyst kind of level, entry-level job.
Right, exactly. So if you have to go take like a 70% pay cut after already being established in your industry as somebody who's, in their early 30s, that's a hard sell to your wife and kids. Hey, honey, we're going to go move to this college town, and the job security is going to be about zero just so I can work my way up the ladder. You see what I'm saying? So I think the relationship that he had with Clark Lee and Clark's knowledge of Barton's knowledge of the game, because he knows how he thinks, he knows the type of hard worker that he is, and the insight that he has into the recruiting process and all the contacts that he has, I think that made it a unique situation. So I don't think it's going to become a huge trend anytime soon.
Yeah. And just, listen, journalism doesn't pay that great, but at a certain point in the coaching profession, and if we look at what those positions as sort of an offshoot of the coaching profession, that's a grind too. I mean, journalism again can be kind of a grind as far as like starting out with very low pay and, internships and things along those lines. But entry level into the coaching profession, I mean, again, low level schools or places, even bigger schools where they're just sort of stacking analysts and interns and GAs. I mean, you're basically making nothing. So you're right. I mean, you're talking about relatively established journalists who are at least making a decent living, and then asking them to take a step back into jobs that are barely paying anything. Again, you're almost like a grad assistant to a certain degree.
Exactly. Yeah. Guys of that age don't take those jobs for the most part. I mean, regardless of whether you're coming from the media side or not.
Bud Elliott is from 24/7 Sports. What's your title there again, Bud?
I'm the origination editor, head of podcasts, and national recruiting analyst.
Yeah, Bud's got a lot on his plate there, and he was nice enough to talk to me the day before signing day, because even though it's not what it used to be, it's not the circus that it used to be. I'm sure it's still a busy time for you guys. So appreciate your time and effort and knowledge, Bud. It's always fun to talk to you. Most of your favorite baseball team is run by Fangraphs guys, right? Like the Rays are pretty much all Fangraphs at this point, right?
It is. I mean, I'm actually wearing my Rays hat right now, so that was well timed.
Excellent. Always great talking to you, Bud. Thanks for all the knowledge, and hopefully we'll get to catch up again real soon.
Enjoyed it, dude.
And now 3 and out. First down. One of the biggest prizes in the transfer portal appears to be heading to Florida. Eric Gilbert, a former 5-star tight end who played a freshman year last season at LSU, posted on social media that he's joining the Gators. Gilbert had okay numbers last year for an LSU offense that ran through 3 quarterbacks, but there is a lot to like here. No doubt he liked what Florida did last season with star tight end Kyle Pitts, and the selling point was surely, well, you could be next. Florida also landed a former 5-star running back, DeMarcus Bowman, who left Clemson after last season. While Florida says goodbye to a ton of offensive production with Kyle Trask, Pitts, Kadarius Toney on the way to the NFL, plus a few other excellent receivers, there are a lot of interesting pieces for Dan Mullen to work with between the newcomers and holdover quarterbacks Emory Jones and Anthony Richardson. As good as Florida was offensively this past season, there is room for some growth or at least some evolution with a more mobile quarterback. Dan Mullen likes to use the quarterback in the running game. That's always been his thing, but it wasn't necessarily Kyle Trask's thing. In the pipeline, though, you have quarterbacks with those skills who should provide more of that next season. Plus, another potential game changer at tight end in Gilbert. Second down. To say Arizona's hiring of Jedd Fisch was met with skepticism both nationally and locally would be a bit of an understatement. Fisch is a longtime college and NFL assistant with a good reputation and good connections, but the results have never really stood out. He hasn't been part of particularly successful teams or notably exceptional offenses. He does seem to be putting together an interesting staff at Arizona, including former Michigan defensive coordinator Don Brown, though I do think it's fair to wonder if the style Brown likes to play just went stale at Michigan or if he can still be successful in a new conference. What caught my eye, though, was the recent hire by Fisch of Teddy Bruschi, the former Arizona great and New England Patriots player, as senior advisor to the coach. What exactly that job becomes relative to the title is hard to say. I think it could be, in the short term, a way to address what I know was a really big concern among folks close to Arizona. The program has lost its identity and has no brand. Listen, Arizona's football history is not illustrious. It's the only Pac-12 school among those that were in the Pac-10 that has never played in the Rose Bowl. Bruschi was part of maybe Arizona's most famous teams, the Desert Swarm defenses of the mid to late 1990s. I think Fisch keeping former Arizona great Chuck Cecil on staff and bringing in Bruschi is an encouraging acknowledgement that he needed to figure out a way, not just to build a program, but to restore a brand in Tucson. Now we'll see if he can coach and recruit. Third down. Right before we started recording this podcast, news came that EA Sports is bringing back its college football video game. Now, that doesn't do much for me, but I know a whole bunch of folks who love college football really love that game, and it's really huge news for them. The door is open for a new NCAA video game now that it's apparent college athletes will be permitted to earn money from their names, images, and likenesses. EA Sports has set no timetable on the game's return, which is good because currently there is no timetable for NIL rules to be in place for college athletes. The NCAA was ready to put some legislation in place last month, but that got put on pause due to Department of Justice scrutiny. There are federal bills related to NIL and college athletics being put forth in Washington, a bunch of state laws making their way through the system around the country. And, oh, by the way, a Supreme Court case coming up in the spring, which could make everything we just mentioned moot. But the video game so many fans love appears to be on its way back. The question still to be worked out is, who ends up getting paid for it? That's the show for today. I'd like to thank my producer, Sarah McCrory, for making me sound good. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Westwood One Podcast. Please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. Thanks for listening, and come back for more next week of the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast.